No man chooses evil because it is evil. He only mistakes it for happiness. The good he seeks.
The Titan Prometheus is one of the most highly revered characters in the pantheon of Greek mythology. He's most famous for defying the god Zeus by stealing fire from Mount Olympus and giving it to mankind, so that they can fend for themselves without relying on the gods for everything. His punishment for the act was to be chained to the side of a mountain for all eternity. Each morning, a bird would swoop down and eat his liver, only for it to regenerate so that it could be eaten again the next day. The story of Prometheus is a classic example of hubris, the idea that we are ultimately punished when we defy the gods, or bite off more than we can chew, so to speak. In 1818, Mary Shelley's famous novel Frankenstein was first published. The subtitle of the book was The Modern Prometheus. Frankenstein as a novel is about a multitude of topics, but for now, I want to focus on this mythological reference to Prometheus and how Universal's original film adaptations ran with these ideas and ultimately changed them.
I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart.
In the novel, Victor believes he can harness the power to restore or give life for good, but it ultimately brings nothing but destruction. Frankenstein the novel plays out like a Christian version of Prometheus. The Prometheus's fire in this context is the power to create life from death. Victor is in a sense usurping God's role. Victor desires to bring life to a being he creates with his own hands, from body parts taken from local graves. What he ultimately creates is a misunderstood monster that society rejects. The monster goes on to murder Victor's friends and loved ones, ultimately leading to the death of his fiancée on their wedding night. Victor then swears revenge on his creation and travels to Antarctica to destroy it. After its publication, the novel became a seminal piece of literature that has never left print to this day. It was only a matter of time before Hollywood would try its hand at adapting the classic story.
It's moving. It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
Censor Joseph Breen had cautioned Whale that his script contained objectionable references to Dr. Frankenstein that, quote, compare him to God and which compare his creation of the monster to God's creation of man. All such references should be eliminated.
Over 100 years after the book's publication, film studio Universal was looking to adapt the work of Frankenstein after their first major horror film, Dracula, was a huge box office success. The first film, simply titled Frankenstein, strays a great deal from the events of the book, but keeps the core fundamental ideas. Man playing God is a sin and will unleash chaos. The opening of the film is a scene in which actor Edward Van Sloan gives the audience a friendly warning about the contents of what they are about to be shown, going so far as to directly reference Shelley's original subtext, the hubris of man.
We're about to unfold the story of Frankenstein, a man of science who sought to create a man after his own image, without reckoning upon God.
During the film, Henry, aka Victor, forsakes his bride to be in order to work on his experiments. To a 1930s audience, Henry was avoiding a heterosexual relationship in favor of creating life on his own. In Anne K. Mellor's book, Mary Shelley, Her Life, Her Fiction, Her Monsters, she says, quote,
"At every level, Victor Frankenstein is engaged upon a rape of nature, a violent penetration and usurpation of the female's hiding places of the wound. terrified of female sexuality and the power of human reproduction it enables. Both he and the patriarchal society he represents use the technologies of science to manipulate, control, and repress women.
To a mostly Christian audience almost 100 years ago, this would have been sacrilegious and unheard of. In the film, Henry eventually forsakes the experiment and prepares to be wed to his fiancée Elizabeth. However, the festivities are interrupted by the monster. The entire affair is practically a manifestation of Henry's sinful urges, bubbling up to ruin everything that would help him integrate into quote-unquote normal society. This theme of forsaking heterosexual relationships in favor of creating life in untraditional manners will come up again in the sequel, Bride of Frankenstein. Bride of Frankenstein opens with a prologue of Mary Shelley, played by Elsa Lanchester, explaining to Lord Byron what her novel is ultimately about.
The publishers did not see that my purpose was to write a moral lesson. The punishment that befell a mortal man who dared to emulate God.
Bride of Frankenstein picks up just after the events of the first film and builds upon the ideas of its predecessor. Once again, we follow Henry as he tries to forget about the monster he created. Unfortunately, not long after he starts his recovery, an old colleague of his comes knocking. Dr. Pretorius is not only the primary villain of the story, but his presence represents the temptation Henry is feeling to once again abandon his soon-to-be wife in order to pursue creation of a more unnatural kind.
You and I, together. No. No. Leave the charnel house and follow the lead of nature. Or of God, if you like your Bible stories. Male and female created he them. Be fruitful and multiply. Create a race, a man-made race upon the face of the earth. Why not? I daren't even think of such a thing. Our mad dream is only half realized. Alone you have created a man. Now together we will create his mate.
Pretorius is also a coded homosexual, and that's most likely on purpose. After all, the director James Whale was gay, and it's very likely he sought to imbue the film with a little bit of his dark sense of humor.
The part went to Wales's British theatrical mentor, Ernest Thesiger, whose malignantly waspish persona elucidated not only the Faustian elements of the story, but its sexual ambiguities as well. Pretorius, Frankenstein's mentor at school, would be a gay Mephistopheles.
Eventually, Henry is tempted into helping Pretorius create a mate for the monster. Whereas the first film was about Henry treading on the footsteps of God, Bride of Frankenstein instead focuses on the homosexual undertones of Henry forsaking his bride-to-be to instead create another monster with another man. A few years after Bride of Frankenstein was released, Universal began developing a sequel. What we ended up with is what I think is one of the more underrated horror films of the era, that being Son of Frankenstein. Son of Frankenstein takes place many years after Bride and focuses on Henry's son, Wolf. Wolf has inherited his father's estate and is moving his family to the town of Frankenstein, where his father Henry used to live. When he arrives, he finds out that the townsfolk don't look too kindly on his father or his legacy. After all, the town was ravaged for years by the monster, and many believe Wolf will continue his father's work. Right off the bat, we see the third film shift from the Prometheus, or treading on God's domain themes, to focusing on the idea of generational sin. Generational sin, also called sins of the father or ancestral sin, is present in many religions around the world, and is the idea that we bear some of the responsibility, or will ultimately reenact the crimes of the previous generation. So the villagers believe Wolf will create another monster like his father did, and bring ruin and destruction to the town once again. Wolf doesn't seem to want to do that, but he's ultimately sympathetic to his father's ideas, and says as much multiple times in the first 10 minutes of the film.
Because of...
Yes, because of the things my father did there. I remember stories my mother used to tell me when I was quite young in England. It wasn't my father's fault that the being he created became a senseless, murderous monster. He was right. You understand that, don't you, dear? He was right.
He later discovers that the monster his father created is still alive, being kept under his laboratory on the family estate. After speaking with Igor, played by Bela Lugosi in arguably the best role he ever played, Wolf caves in and works to regenerate the monster, hoping to correct his father's work. Ultimately, it goes about as well as you'd imagine. The monster goes around murdering various people, and the villagers in the town suspect Wolf had some part to play in his return. It isn't until Wolf kills the monster in the sulfur pit that the town is saved and the cycle of generational sin is broken. After this, Wolf and his family leave town for good. Universal's Frankenstein films are a good example of how a piece of art can evolve over time while still maintaining most of its core ideas. Much like the quote from Shelley at the beginning of this video, the story of Frankenstein, regardless of interpretation, tends to follow this core idea. In other words, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions.
My son, herein you will find my faiths, my beliefs, and my unfoldments. A complete diary of my experiments, charts, secret formulas. In short, the sum total of my knowledge, such as it is. Perhaps you will regard my work with ridicule, or even with distaste. If so, destroy these records. But if you, like me, burn with the irresistible desire to penetrate the unknown, carry on. Even though the path is cruel and torturous, carry on. Like every seeker after truth, you will be hated, blasphemed, and condemned. But mayhap where I have failed, you will succeed. You have inherited the fortune of the Frankensteins. I trust you will not inherit their fate.